Shalom Aleichem, Rabbi Sai. This is Yehuda Levin, your harbinger of Hashkafa, founder and dean of the University of Old-Time Torah Morality, and with 99% of my brain tied behind Rush Limbaugh's back, I can pledge to you that you will get more Hashkafa and insight in this hour than you'll get from an entire year of Aguda conventions and shmuzin and droshes from Rabbi N on all kinds of subject matter, because basically nobody touches the hashkafa of Torah morality and how we're supposed to deal with it. In terms of our table of contents, we have a very special guest tonight, one of the top askonim in the world on moral issues, Rav Leiter. We'll be speaking to him presently. Additionally, we're going to speak about the fact that Simcha Felder is still out there in left feld, a big embarrassment and a big disappointment, despite what he did for yeshivas. We're going to talk about kudos to Rabbi Schaefer for this week's shmooze that's printed and that goes tens of thousands of people. And we're going to give you a segment of that shmooze because it's tremendously important. We're going to talk about Lakewood's pride and joy, quote unquote. Rabbi Fagi, I gave him a new name, Fagi Moskowitz, the posek of the gay and lesbian synagogue Bet Simchat Torah in Manhattan. So we want to give a big welcome to the newest tzaddik to emerge from the Lakewood system, and we question what Lakewood is going to do about it. We're going to answer a question that's on everybody's mind, that many, many people who are frustrated, the chutzpah of this guy, Yehuda Levin, to go and say menungs and to challenge Moistus and Kehillis and Klal Yisrael. Who am I? Who does he think he is? Was war asot business with us? We're going to respond to this with a secular niggin and an explanation of who I am. We're going to answer this question because the fact is that it was told to me by a little fegela that there was actually like a meeting of Askonim from Aguda and Lakewood and Satmar and Lubavitch and all kinds of people, and they're all sitting and saying, Wer der Levin, who am I? We're going to answer that in song and in prose. Moving right along, we're going to talk a little bit more about Aguda's bold statement together with all the lefties on the terrible avla of the Trump administration of separating children from their parents when they come across the border from Mexico. But we're going to ask, how about the frum kids deprived of their fathers by our Batei Din and by our feminist rabbinate? And what is Agudas Yisrael doing about that? Before they worry about the kids from the Mexicana, how about worrying about the Yiddish Kindler who don't have fathers and who don't have parents? And then moving right along, we asked the question, we spoke last week about the Shorish of Askonim in the Torah being the Meraglim. Those are obviously the negative Askonim. So turnabout is fair play. Where are the good Askonim in the Torah? We're going to give you the Makar in the Torah for the good Askonim. Then we want to mention that next week is going to be one of the most explosive programs that ever appeared on Jewish radio and Jewish video. I have agreed to have on Harav David Eidenson, who is not your typical Talmud Chacham, and nobody can deny a man who's 75, 76 years old. He's a Machabes Swarm and a significant Talmud Chacham. Whether you feel that you enjoy or appreciate what he has to say or you're outraged by it, I can assure you, you won't be bored, because next week, Rav David Eidenson is going to talk about the fact that he wants to institute Pelegesh in Klal Yisrael, and we're going to discuss it here, now, in the next week or two. If Rav David's available, we already discussed a commitment to Lineda, and we're going to try to discuss that next week. So spread the word, because if I bore you on the programs, I assure you, when he starts talking about Pelegesh and why he wants to institute that and the reasons behind it, nobody will be bored. And I want to issue a public challenge, a public invitation. If there is any Rav or Talmud Chacham out there, because Rav David Einstein had a lot of Choshev rabbinic colleagues that he was friends with for tens of years, who have disassociated themselves with him because of what they felt was his Wilkeit in this proposal. Nevertheless, he's very stark in what he wants to say. I am not taking any part in deciding who am I to stick my head amongst Choshev Rabbonim. I'm just your humble little servant, providing a forum not only to Rabbi Eidenson, but to any antagonist of Rabbi Eidenson that wants to come on bebas achas with him, or right after him, or the following week, and explain why this is amaratzis, this is outrageous, this is a chutzpah, this is a betrayal of everything that Yiddishkeit stands for. Bevakasha, contact me at rabbilevin@gmail.com, and anybody else wants to contact me. And bevakasha, if you have program ideas, if there's things that you want to discuss that you feel is important, and I agree with you, I'll be happy to accommodate you as well. Moving right along. We're going to talk very briefly about the fact that one of the top Democrats in the country, a Congressman Crowley, was defeated by a newcomer who's an ultra-leftist Meshugana, and we'll just touch upon what that means and why that's happening. We're going to sing Tzeichem B'Shalom to that Oisov of Russia, Marusha. I don't know how many things recently he voted for on the conservative side. It could be as many as 14 things this year. Justice Kennedy, that he is a Russia, Marusha, who's asidin to give a din, and he's going to be in a very deep place because he is single-handedly responsible for the same gender hashchasa marriage debacle. So we're going to just wish him a quick Tzeichem B'Shalom. Ben Shapiro, for those who know who it is, a Shem Torah Mitzvahs, modern Orthodox, a brilliant fellow who's syndicated on radio. He's even on WABC now. He does videos. He makes frequent appearances. And B'chlal, he's pretty much a great spokesman for conservative values and is a Kiddush Hashem. But his one-page peon, his hosannas that he's singing to Charles Krauthammer, I have a great deal of difficulty with it. And this is a microcosm of what's wrong, even with the conservative movement and even with people who are shalonu in the conservative movement. And I'll explain for the highbrows in the audience who might know who Ben Shapiro or Krauthammer is. And finally, Israel Knesset and the European Vad HaRabbonim have told worldwide Jewry, get out of here when it comes to Eretz Yisrael. We'll elaborate. And now, without further ado, we will go right to our very special guest who I'd like to introduce. I know Rav Leiter, I don't know if it's close to 20 years, but certainly 15 years, more than 15 years. And he is an Asken extraordinary. He has been Moise Nefesh, and around 8 years ago, when they codified same-gender marriage in New York, and I've told this story a few times, that a guy named Andrew Hum, a huge oisvarf, Andrew Hum, was there at our protest march on the Sunday that they started doing Kaisvin Ksubel Zachar, and he walked over to me, and at the end of his brief exchange, this Oisvarf Menuvel said to me, I want you to know that you and a handful of people held up this day of same-gender marriage, either he said 10 or 15 years. Who was this handful of people that you might be able to count, certainly on less than two hands? One of these people has been Rav Leiter, who in the assignment that we all have to divvy up, we very few Askanim have to divvy up the whole world to deal with moral issues. So Rav Nosson Leiter, who hails from Monsey, New York, definitely has Monsey and New York State and New Jersey, where he's done a tremendous amount of work in the past few years and has taken Lakewood Jungelite to Trenton on more than one occasion. Recently, this past week, on the yard site of the decision of the Supreme Court to find a constitutional right, for same-gender marriage, Rabbi Leiter was matriach to travel to Washington, D.C. to speak briefly at not a huge rally or demonstration, and Rabbi Leiter is with us to tell us about what occurred, why he went, and what he said. Rabbi Leiter, Shalom Aleichem, good evening.
Thank you very much, Rabbi N, for having me on the program.
It's my pleasure, and this is just the first. In Yitzhak Hashem, Hashem should give me koyach, and He should give me the financial wherewithal to continue this lowly struggle. And in Yitzhak Hashem, we plan to have you on with some more regularity. So tell us, you traveled to speak. There's a Gentile who's from the Hasidim Sa'olam, Peter LaBarbara, who has an organization in which he's one of the strongest loichmim against the hashkasa, and even in the aftermath of the codification of the hashkasa, he doesn't give up. His name is Peter LaBarbara, and he invited you to come out and speak, and you traveled at great sacrifice. You know, you sit and learn, you're in the kollel, and you do other things. Your time is very valuable, and yet you felt it was important to go out there, even to something that was largely ignored by the press. And hopefully some publicity will come out of it in the future. But of course, the press, the fake news, as Trump calls them, ignored it. But you knew this going in, that there was a good chance. What was your cheshbon to go? Why do you feel it's so important?
Well, one reason is that there needs to be an articulate Orthodox representation in addressing the core needs of the pro-morality movement. And that's not only because of the requirements of Kiddush Hashem and reducing the tremendous Chil Hashem being perpetrated not only by non-Orthodox Jews, but the Chil Hashem being perpetrated by those that represent, or I should say misrepresent, Orthodox Jewry, both in terms of what they do and more in terms of what they don't do fighting these things. So we need to make sure that we are visible to the world in forms that the world may be looking at.
So let me ask you, if you could reprise for us. I know you spoke for approximately 2 minutes.
Yes.
If you could give us your statement, please.
Okay. In Leviticus chapter 18, verse 22, the act of sodomy is branded an abomination, even among the abominations enumerated there. Judaism unequivocally condemns so-called homosexual marriage, even if only its participants recognize it. Indescribably worse is societal recognition of marriage equality. It makes everyone who fails to oppose it a partner in this crime. Our Jewish sages teach us in Vayikra Rabbah 23:9 on Vayikra 18 verse 3 that recognition of both male and female same-gender, quote, marriages were a pivotal factor in causing Noah's flood. But there is hope. Even in 2018, even in liberal New York, many bad bills were stopped. But we must ask, how did we get here? The Supreme Court decision was not the beginning. The Supreme Court nationalized what had been perpetrated around the country over the previous decade, mostly or in great measure legislatively, not judicially. The anti-marriage campaign only reached the Supreme Court after years of far too many conservatives compromising with leftists or deprioritizing this critical issue. So what do we do now? Just vote Republican? No. The Republican Party also led us to the Supreme Court decision destroying the definition of marriage. New York State passed marriage equality in June 2011, 4 years before the infamous betrayal of the Supreme Court, and did so with the full approval of Republican Senate leaders, including Skelos in particular. And the leading opponent was a Democratic senator. So it's not partisanism that matters. And just like this did not start with the Supreme Court, it did not end there either. The Supreme Court decision enabled the left to fight the broader LGBT war with renewed force. In New York, there are well over double the number of To'eva LGBT bills being pushed today than were being pushed in 2011 when they passed marriage equality in New York. Nevertheless, some very good people in quote-unquote liberal New York stopped many of those bills. We must remember that. Now we see how wise were all those who rejected the claim that if we'd only sacrifice on marriage, then the other side, the Dor HaMabul lobby, will behave. We know that's false. We also cannot afford to forget that we are on the winning side. As the Novi says, there are many more with us than are with them. Every LGBT To'eva victory breeds stronger agitation for more success, and every LGBT bill that we stop impedes their pushing for two more. We must hold all elected officials at all levels, even local levels, accountable for their actions, or we'll suffer for their sins. And Be'ezus Hashem, with the help of God, we can do it. We can stop and reverse some of the trends that we allowed in some measure to occur. Thank you all. Now that's basically what I said.
Rabbi Leiter, we have to be brief, but just I appreciate very much what you said, and this is very important because this program is talking to a new door of people. Asher Yodas Yosef, they don't necessarily know about Rav Avigdor Miller firsthand, the Kasha Varov, the Debretziner Rav, Rav Moshe Feinstein, and many Ziknei Yisrael who fought this. They're unaware of this, and I, and to an extent, of course, you are links to this Darsha Avar, and this program is about the hashkafa of giving hands-on instruction to every ish ve'isha in their own ways, that they have the ability to do things, to be Mekadesh Shem Shemayim, and to prevent a lot of kitrug and a lot of further chas v'shalom success of this antithetical, anti-Yiddish, anti-Torah, anti-Kedusha movement. And that's why I wanted them to hear how you present and what you present, and it was very, very well said and very encouraging. I literally am going over time, but just tell me briefly, are there one or two points very succinctly that you would like to make in this particular edition of 11 at 11 to be over the Olam, whether it's in Lakewood, New Jersey, or in New York, or just the general tzibur?
Yes, thank you. First of all, again, focus on legislation at all levels. Anytime we see bad legislation or need good legislation, we have to pressure our politicians, and the more local it is, generally, the more effect we can have. And people can do a lot, not just by voting, but also by not believing false hadracha given to them under the guise of Das Torah. Rav Aaron Kotler says, it's brought down in the first volume of Mishnah Rav Aaron, in Chelik Beis, Perik Gimel, Sibov, that the biggest threat to Yiddishkeit is not anti-Semitism, it's not assimilation, it's ziyuf HaTorah, perversion of the Torah. And the way to avoid that is in part simply by not believing propaganda. And that's something we all can do. I do want to mention that the Republicans in Congress have the opportunity to push for religious protections for religious institutions, which is very limited. But even that very limited legislation, which has 100 supporters, was not pushed by the Republicans in Congress, even though they are in power. And the question is, what are they waiting for? So that's something people should, to the extent that they can, try to raise with the right people.
Okay, Rev Nosson, I want to thank you very, very much. You honored us by being with us. It's a big chizik to me personally. You're a colleague for the better part of over 2 decades, and wish you continued hatzlacha. And we look forward to having you on in a future program in the future. You always have an open door here when you have nekudas that you want to discuss. Thank you very much. Good evening.
Thank you, and thank you for all the help, and the inspiration over the years. And
call to. Ma'ariv Rabbi Sai, moving right along. Simcha Felder still in left field. That means he did something good with fighting for the yeshivas, but he did negative stuff, and I want to again bring this to your attention. The Jewish press every week has an article having to do with the culture wars. I'm holding this up, And I want to tell you again, you can't really see it that clearly, maybe you could see it. This is the article. And I want to encourage everybody. It's absolutely important. I'm telling you, it's a mitzvah gedolah to be machazik the Jewish press that chas v'sholem. They shouldn't stop doing what they're doing. They should continue to give us the information about legislation and legislators and to educate the public. This will ultimately be his chayvus and Yated Hamadia and the others who are not doing and have never done anywhere near achrayas to do. And therefore, I'm pleading with you, those who can call up and ask for a subscription at 718-331-1100 or 330-1100 and ask them for the $15 subscription for 6 months. It's mamish kedai, and I believe you can ask your rabbanim. And I really think that they can tell you, if you have to, you can take it from my money, because it's been machazik, kedoshim to you, and so many other mitzvahs. Okay? So I just want to tell you that Simcha Felder voted in the last day of the legislative session. The state Senate voted in favor of a bill that extends the current law banning discrimination against sexual orientation to public schools. The law mandates that public schools stop the, quote, harassment of any student or applicant by reason of his sexual orientation. Considering what passes for harassment and discrimination these days, this bill is rather egregious, and Simcha Felder voted for it. Shame, shame, shame. And maybe somebody can go to his brother Diane Felder and ask him, maybe Diane Felder, since Simcha has a record over the years of in the city council and doing schreckliche things on occasion for morality. That means he might do 80% good stuff, but 20% of the time he makes a chil Hashem oyin v'noira on morality issues. Maybe Diane Felder, his brother, the Talmud Chacham, can tell him, Simchala, you have to discuss bills with me. There should be a specific address, because either he doesn't know what he's doing or it's rishus. I prefer that he doesn't know what he's doing. His brother can help him out. Isn't there a certain achrayus, just like this in Yonim, that with families, you have to give tzedakah first to your families? I think that families have an achrayus, families of politicians, to give them hadracha when they've been 10 or 12 or more years in the business and they're still making chil Hashem's ad hayem hashvua hazeh va'ad bichlal. Moving right along. Lakewood has a new poisik of hashchasa. We're talking about this guy, Moskowitz, this person Moskowitz. I am not competent to figure out the psychological problems that this guy has. He's Lichtensteinian, meaning David Lichtenstein, to an extreme. David Lichtenstein in this discussion with me was speaking about he was speaking about the gefühl for his fellow Jew and everything else, etc., etc. And, Avad can be Makalkal the Shur and everything else. And David was finding excuses that Mishkav Zachas and Oinlis, and we have to understand them and give them a list and then all other shtusim. So now you have the next step. Your next step, in other words, David Lichtenstein that comes out of Lakewood and says this kind of stuff, and 25,000 listeners on headline that he claims that he has. And I tend to believe him because he built it up over 5 years with a lot of investment. You understand? So he has listeners. And a lot of them are B'nai Torah from Lakewood. And they didn't give him shrek on this thing. So Hashem says, it always works like that. This is Hashkafa 101. Mida kedeg mida. The people and the places that they don't show enough that they care and everything else. So Lakewood should be speaking out against this guy Moskowitz. Frankly, he shouldn't be free to walk the streets of Haredi Lakewood. He doesn't belong there. If he would have kids there. So when the powers that be in Lakewood, coming down from the chief rabbinical powers to the chief Haskanim powers, in the past have sometimes punished people who disagree with them or they feel are wrong, and exiled their children from the schools, like what they did with Rabbi Sorsha, an outstanding Talmud Chacham, what they did to Rabbi Sorsha. They drove him out of Lakewood. Tell me something, Rabbi Sorsha, who they were wrong, and some of them had to apologize to, him they drove out of Lakewood. I want to ask you a question. Is anybody going to drive Moskowitz out of Lakewood? I'm going in the Mahalach of Maxine Waters. Maxine Waters said you're allowed to do harassment. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. In Yisrael, Lakewood. Why don't they put up signs against what Moskowitz is doing? If he has kids there, they should take his kids out of yeshiva. If he doesn't, they should put in the Lakewood, the scoop or the Lakewood poop or whatever it is. I mean, in the papers and this and that, they should put up a sign. We are retracting and taking away the smicha from this oisvav. And there should be a fundraiser in Lakewood. Everyone should give a nickel so they can put together, let's say, $100. And Moskowitz should get at least one meeting with a frum psychologist to try to help him understand why he needs the attention of being the bleeding heart liberal, the open heart until the Zarvera, the chesed to the extent of Achzorius, that he's supporting Balei Teyeva and Balei Taiva, and he's making a Chilul Hashem oin v'noira, that who knows what he's doing with his Olam Haba. If Harav Aaron Kotler, the CEO of Lakewood, sent me that because of what I said several weeks ago, I'm playing with my Olam Haba. Rav Aaron, do you think Moskowitz is playing with his Olam Haba? Maybe you should do something about it. Maybe you should help him. He's in your bailiwick. It's your achrayas. Once the Novorinsky Rebbe Shlita said about a certain child molester, when they came to him, there was a reason he said it, crowd. He was right. He was being makbel on the cover to molested. There was a reason why. I'm not going to get into it. But he said something that was very puzzling to the tzibur. He said, I'm in Borough Park, and there are abundant in Flatbush. The molester lives in Flatbush. So therefore, it's their responsibility. He said it to avoid because he was actually doing a lot about it. But nevertheless, we're going to use the Novominskerian Yisoid. If the Torah is now divided, in other words, if you're in Borough Park, it's one thing, in Flatbush, another thing, it's in Eretz Yisrael. So like one of the people in the Badatz told me, if you want us to write against that, you shouldn't have a homosexual parade in Ganz Eretz Yisrael, you have to speak to the Gedolim B'nai Brak. So I said, oh, you mean it's a separate. He tells me, Asara Kedushas. So I said, oh, you mean Kedoshim Tio doesn't apply equally to all Chalakim Eretz Yisrael because the Chazal say Asara Kedushas to Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, you can't take achrayas for the rest of the world, let alone Eretz Yisrael. It was ridiculous on his face. So the same thing over here. Reb Aaron, take care of Moskowitz. Get the Rosh Yeshivas, get people. There should be a statement to the whole world. The guy's a manuvel. This is out in the media. Zeb Brenner had this already 2 months ago on the radio. It's a Chil Oim V'Noira and Memach Shvaig. He's not going away. It's Mime'ayach. It's in your guts. He's right there in the belly of the beast in Lakewood. Moskowitz, yeah. Let's go weiter. Kudos to Rabbi Schaefer for this week's shmooze. I want to read to you what Rabbi Schaefer wrote. I'm reading because many people might have seen it. It's so gewaldic when somebody does something like this in this Dora Basra. It's called losing all sense of decency. He says like this. He says that the New York Times was approached in the early 1900s, at the beginning of the 20th century, to do a clothing advertisement for pregnant women's clothing. And you can imagine pregnant women's clothing 120 years ago was very tzniustik. They refused to do it. They felt it was impropriety. How far we've fallen, says Rabbi Schaefer. Then he says, from the early 1900s until today, the state of morality in America has deteriorated at a baffling pace. Our most religious-based Yaakov graduates would be put to shame by the modest dress of the average woman, meaning secular, non-Jewish, of that time. Rabbi Schaefer is talking Yehuda Levin talk, and I love to hear somebody else saying it, because he's much more mukubal than me. He's much more, quote-unquote, mainstream. It's gewaldic. Power to you and power to the influence that you have, Rabbi Schaefer. What has changed? The simple reality is that women in those days dressed modestly because there was a prevailing sense of propriety and self-respect. A dignified woman wouldn't go out in the streets in all states of undress. Even if she dreamed of it, her father, brother, mother, or sister would have pulled her aside and saying, you're shaming the family. The counterculture revolution of the 1960s has turned things on its head. Society is falling apart. With that history in mind, we can understand the Moabite women. It was a puzzling contradiction. They acted chastely in a sinful society. While it's true that they disregarded morality represented by the worship of Baal Pa'ar, they still had a sense of dignity and self-respect. They may have been immoral, but they weren't animals. A father wouldn't allow his Moabite daughter to walk out dressed provocatively, nor would a husband permit his wife to do the same. It was only Bilam's advice that unraveled the last threads of decency of the Moabites and the Moabite women. Today we are seeing the last threads of our own society, sense of decency unraveling. Our world has gone off the deep end. What 10 years ago was understood as a psychological illness is now touted as normal and expressive. What 5 years ago was abhorrent is now defended as a constitutional right. And if one speaks out against abnormality, one is branded hateful and phobic. While these developments are occurring in the secular world, their effects creep into our camp as well. Rabbi Schaefer, right on. Rev Miller and company, the Ziknei Adar from the Doshava would be proud of you. We may still be leagues above other nations. Listen, but he's talking about the Fruma now. But there have been great inroads against propriety, dignity, and self-respect among our people as well, a leitmotif of this program. We require constant reinforcement to remember that we are the chosen nation and that far more is expected of us. One of the best ways to do that is to recognize that what passes for normal living today is neither normal nor living. While the challenge is great, these are but passing times. There will come a time when we will all look back in utter astonishment and ask, what were people thinking? Ayasher Koyach, Tiskul Mrs. Rabbi Schaefer, upward and onwards in your Hatzlacha. Moving right along, we're going to pause here for a very brief moment, and then we're coming back for part 2 of our program.